The boardroom, on the 32nd floor of Meridian Tower, was the kind of room that made people feel small on purpose. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, the Toronto skyline spread below, like a reminder of what was at stake. Around the table sat 6 people in tailored suits, 2 attorneys, a pair of senior executives from a European pharmaceutical consortium, and at the head of it all, Diane Calloway, founder and CEO of Calloway Medical Group. The 7th person in the room wasn't sitting. He was standing near the credenza at the far wall, refilling a carafe of water, wearing a gray service vest that had been washed too many times. His name was Arthur Pendleton. Nobody had looked at him once since he arrived, which was exactly what he was used to. Arthur had worked facilities and hospitality at Meridian Tower for 3 years, long enough to know which boardrooms required sparkling water versus still, which executives liked the blinds angled down during afternoon sun, and which conversations were the kind that happened between the words being spoken. He had learned early on that a man pushing a service cart through a room full of money became, in the eyes of that room, invisible. Not unkindly, just practically. Invisible was a condition he had spent 3 years cultivating with great care. Before Meridian Tower, Arthur had lived a different kind of life. He had spent 19 years as a pharmaceutical regulatory attorney, first in Ottawa, then in Toronto, eventually consulting across borders for firms navigating Health Canada approvals and FDA crossover filings. He had been meticulous, patient, and quietly brilliant at finding the clause inside the clause, the language that looked standard until it didn't. Colleagues called him thorough. Opposing counsel called him something less flattering. He had built a career on the principle that precision in language was the difference between a deal that held and one that unraveled 2 years later in a courtroom. Then his wife died. Not suddenly. That was the part people never understood when they offered their condolences. Ellen had been sick for 4 years, and every one of those years, Arthur had stayed. He had taken reduced hours, then a leave of absence, then a quiet resignation that his firm had accepted with the kind of professional sympathy that meant they had already begun looking for his replacement. By the time Ellen passed, he had lost the career, the saving structure he had planned, and the identity that had held everything together. His daughter, Nora, was 12. She needed stability, and stability, he decided, meant a life without ambition, without exposure, without the particular kind of loss that came from reaching for things. He found the facility's position at Meridian through a community board posting. He had been overqualified in ways that didn't fit on any application form, so he left most of his history off. Gerald, the building's hospitality manager, had hired him for his quietness and his attention to detail, 2 qualities that translated well regardless of what a man had been before. He had been doing this for 3 years. Nora was 15 now. They had a routine. That was enough. The meeting in the 32nd floor boardroom had been scheduled for 6 weeks. Arthur had been briefed by Gerald that morning, with the kind of seriousness that meant the building's ownership had been briefed first. A private negotiation between Calloway Medical Group and representatives of a European pharmaceutical consortium called Aldrin Partners. No interruptions. Specific refreshment requirements. Service to remain discreet throughout. Arthur had arrived at 7:30 to set the room. He adjusted the water placement, confirmed the temperature, positioned a second carafe on the credenza, and settled into his post near the far wall, close enough to be useful and far enough to disappear. Diane Calloway arrived at 8:50. She was 61, compact in the way of people who had never wasted energy on anything unnecessary. Her hair was silver and cut short, and she moved through the room the way people move through spaces they had already mentally rearranged to suit themselves. She reviewed the layout, adjusted one of the chairs by half an inch, and gave Arthur a brief nod when he offered water. That was their entire interaction. The Aldrin Partners representatives arrived minutes later. 2 men, the senior partner, a broad-shouldered Belgian named Hendrik, and a younger associate who spoke less and observed more. Their interpreter, introduced as Luc Devereaux, followed them in. Luc was mid-40s, dressed in a suit that announced itself without quite earning the announcement. He moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the most important secondary character in every room he entered. Arthur poured water. He adjusted the credenza. He did not look at anyone directly, but he listened. Luc began translating the opening remarks in both directions, his voice smooth and efficient. The consortium was interested in a licensing partnership for 2 of Callaway Medical's flagship compounds, drugs that were already approved in Canada and parts of Europe, but hadn't yet cleared the specific regulatory channels Aldrin Partners needed for a broader distribution framework. The conversation moved through preliminary pleasantries into territory that required a certain kind of attention. Arthur refilled a glass and stayed near the credenza. He was not supposed to understand what Hendrik and the associate were saying to each other in Flemish. Most people in a room like this wouldn't have, but Arthur had spent 3 years in the early part of his career, working with a Belgian firm on a joint filing, long enough to develop what he described to no one as a functional reading knowledge and an impractical listening knowledge of a language he had never formally studied. He caught roughly 60% of Flemish in real time if the speaker was clear. Hendrik was clear. At first, what he caught seemed within the normal range. Side comments, the kind of marginalia that ran alongside any formal negotiation. Then, around the 40-minute mark, something shifted. Hendrik made a statement to his associate in Flemish. The statement was specific. It concerned the indemnity window on adverse event liability, and what Hendrik said was that their consortium's position was fixed at 36 months and would not move. It was not a preference. It was not a starting point. It was a ceiling, and they had agreed on it before arriving in Toronto. When Luke turned to Diane and rendered the statement in English, what she heard was different. He told her the consortium had expressed a preference for a 36-month window, but remained open to exploring extended frameworks depending on the regulatory profile of each compound. Arthur's hand stopped moving on the carafe. He replayed what he had heard. He replayed what Luke had said. They were not the same thing. A preference open to extended frameworks was the language of negotiation. A fixed ceiling was not. If Diane believed the consortium was flexible on the indemnity window, her legal team would spend time and leverage trying to push it outward, possibly making concessions elsewhere in exchange for movement that was never actually available. She would be trading real value for imaginary room. Arthur set the carafe down on the credenza with great care. He walked into the small anteroom adjacent to the boardroom, where a secondary service cart and a tray of backup supplies were stored. The anteroom had a narrow window that looked out over the building's eastern face, and a chair that no one had ever asked him not to sit in. He sat. He thought about what he had heard with the same methodical attention he had once applied to cross-border regulatory filings. It was possible he had misunderstood. His Flemish was functional, not formal. Hendrik might have said something that carried a nuance Arthur had flattened in the translation. That was a real possibility, and he held it honestly. He also held the other possibility, that what he had heard was accurate, and that Luke had rendered it inaccurately, deliberately, with enough professional polish that no one in the room would know to question it. If the second possibility was true, then Diane Callaway was walking into a negotiation on false terrain. Arthur was a hospitality worker. He pushed a cart. He refilled water. He had signed a discretion agreement on his first day at Meridian that covered exactly these kinds of rooms and exactly these kinds of conversations. Gerald had been clear about that. The building's policy was unambiguous. Service staff did not engage with clients. Service staff did not insert themselves into proceedings of any kind. Service staff remained invisible because invisibility was the service. He thought about his daughter, Nora, who had her mother's particular way of lifting one eyebrow when she was deciding whether something was worth her time. Nora, who had told him 6 months ago, without knowing the weight of what she was saying, that the only thing she remembered from the hardest year of her life was that he had always told her the truth, even when it would have been easier not to. He thought about what it cost to live inside invisibility for 3 years. He stood up. He picked up the backup carafe. He walked back into the boardroom. The negotiation had moved into the next phase. Diane was asking a clarifying question about compound-specific timelines, and Luke was translating the response with the same seamless confidence that had characterized every exchange so far. Arthur moved to Diane's side of the table and began to refill her water glass. He leaned forward slightly, as if adjusting the placement of the glass. His voice came out the way his voice always came out when he had decided something. Level, quiet, and without performance. "The indemnity window isn't flexible," he said. "They've fixed it at 36 months. That was their position before they arrived." He straightened and stepped back to the credenza. Diane Calloway did not move. Her expression did not change. Her eyes stayed on the papers in front of her, but her hand, which had been reaching for her pen, stopped somewhere in the air between intention and contact, and then settled back on the table. For the next several minutes, the room continued. Luke translated. Hendrik answered questions. The associate took notes. Arthur stood near the credenza and waited. He was aware, with the particular clarity that came from having nothing left to protect, that he had just ended his employment at Meridian Tower. Gerald would receive a complaint before the session broke. He would be escorted from the building. The discretion agreement he had signed might result in something formal. He would have to find another position, and whatever community board he found it on would not know his name from the one he was currently dismantling. Nora would be understanding. That was somehow worse. Then Diane asked a question. She addressed Hendrik directly, in English first, and then, after a beat so brief it might have been nothing, she added a sentence in Dutch. Her Dutch was formal and deliberate, the accent carrying the particular weight of someone who had learned the language in a classroom and refined it in a boardroom. She asked Hendrik, plainly and without preamble, to repeat his consortium's position on the indemnity window, not his preference, his position. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Hendrik looked at Luke, then he looked at Diane. Then he answered her directly, in Dutch, with the same words Arthur had heard him say to his associate 40 minutes earlier. 36 months. Fixed, not a starting point. Diane nodded slowly. She set her pen down in the deliberate way of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they were hoping was wrong. She turned to Luke. She did not raise her voice. Diane Calloway had built a pharmaceutical company from a leased lab in Mississauga into a $140 million operation, and she had not done it by raising her voice. She asked Luke, in the same level tone she had used for the past 2 hours, to explain to her how a fixed, non-negotiable position had become, in his translation, an open preference. Luke responded with the composure of someone who had prepared for this possibility. He explained that interpretation at this level was not a mechanical conversion. He said that experienced interpreters understood the cultural context of language and adapted accordingly. He said that characterizing a strong position as a preference was standard practice in sensitive negotiations, designed to create productive space between parties. He called it interpretive calibration. He said this with such conviction that Arthur, standing at the back of the room with a carafe in his hand, almost found himself listening for the logic. Diane did not find the logic. She had reviewed more contracts than Luke had interpreted, and she understood precisely the difference between creating productive space and falsifying the ground beneath someone's feet. She thanked Hendrik and his associate for their patience in English and Dutch both, and told them she needed to suspend the session temporarily to consult with her legal team. She said this would not take long. The Aldrin Partners representatives exchanged a look that Arthur read without difficulty. They were not surprised, they were recalibrating. Hendrik responded that they were happy to wait and that they appreciated her directness. Luke said nothing. Diane's assistant stepped in and guided the consortium representatives to a waiting room down the hall. When the door closed, the boardroom held 4 people. Diane, her lead attorney, Luke, and Arthur, who was standing near the credenza wondering if he should begin clearing the service items. Diane looked at her attorney for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Luke. She told him she was terminating his engagement effective immediately. She said her team would handle the remaining interpretation requirements through a verified service, and that his invoice would be processed for the hours worked up to this point. She said this was not a discussion. Luke picked up his portfolio. He started to say something, then appeared to reconsider. He left the portfolio open on the table and walked out of the room without it, which told Arthur more about the man's composure than anything he had said in 2 hours of interpretation. Then Diane looked at Arthur. He had started moving toward the service cart. It was instinct, the same instinct that had carried him through 3 years of being the person who tidied up after things ended. "Leave that," she said. He stopped. She studied him with the same precision she had applied to the draft terms earlier, not unkindly. Exactly. She asked him how he understood what was said. Arthur considered the range of answers available to him. He could minimize it. He could frame it as a guess, a partial impression, something overheard and possibly misunderstood. He was good at minimizing. He had made an art of it. Instead, he told her, not the autobiography. She didn't need that, and he wasn't prepared to offer it. But enough. 19 years of pharmaceutical regulatory law. Cross-border filings. A Belgian joint venture in his third year that had required him to function in rooms where the language of one side wasn't his own. He told her he had heard Hendrik's original statement clearly, and that he had heard Luke's English rendering, and that they were not the same statement. He told her he had not been certain at first, but he had been certain enough. She listened. When he finished, she asked her attorney to step out. Then she sat down at the long table in the chair she had occupied all morning and did something Arthur did not expect. She pulled a small digital recorder from her jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. She told him she recorded all substantive negotiations. Her legal team had insisted on it after a dispute with a licensee 5 years ago that had come down to competing recollections. She had not mentioned the recorder to anyone in the room because she had learned that people in rooms performed differently when they knew they were being captured. She told him this without apology. Then she told him what her attorney had found in the 12 minutes since the session was suspended. The indemnity window was not the only thing Luke had altered. Across 3 separate exchanges, he had softened Aldrin Partners' language around exclusivity terms, converting what were clearly stated territorial restrictions into suggestions. He had also introduced, in one translation that had no basis in anything Hendrik actually said, a phrase about mutual flexibility on milestone payments that the consortium had never proposed. Arthur listened to this and recognized the pattern. He had seen it once before, in a different context, a consulting case he had worked in his last year of practice, where a deal had been constructed on a foundation that looked solid until someone pulled one document and the whole structure shifted. What Luke had built in that boardroom was a version of the negotiation that would have led Diane's team to believe they had leverage they didn't have and flexibility where none existed. He asked who Luke worked for. Diane said her team was already looking at that question. She told him the negotiation was not over. It was suspended, which was different. She intended to resume it with verified interpretation, full documentation, and a complete transcript comparison between the audio record and the English rendering of everything said in the room. It would add time, it would add cost. But the deal itself was worth pursuing because Aldrin Partners had indicated, in their actual words as opposed to Luke's version of them, that they wanted this partnership. The fixed positions were firm, but they were not unreasonable. A licensing framework she understood accurately was one she could work with. Then she asked Arthur a question he had not expected. She asked him if he would be willing to sit with her legal team for the next 2 hours and help them build a full clause-by-clause comparison between the audio record and what had been presented in the room, not as an employee, not permanently, as someone who understood both the regulatory language at issue and, apparently, enough of the language spoken by the other side to serve as a secondary check. She said she would compensate him for his time at a consulting rate that he could name. He told her he hadn't worked as a consultant in 3 years. She said that didn't answer the question. He stood near the service credenza in a gray vest that had been washed too many times, in a room where a $140 million negotiation had just been paused because one man had decided to tell the truth at the cost of everything practical. He thought about the anteroom chair where he had made the decision. He thought about how small that chair was and how large what followed it had become. He told her yes. What came next was not what anyone outside that boardroom would have called dramatic. It was 4 people in a smaller conference room 2 floors down, a recording played in segments, a legal pad filling with notations, and Arthur's voice saying things like the territorial restriction in exchange. 4 was categorical, not suggestive, and the milestone payment language in exchange 7 has no basis in what was actually proposed. It was the kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside and meant everything from the inside. They worked until early afternoon. Diane's attorney identified 11 discrepancies in total. Arthur confirmed 9 of them from the audio and flagged 2 additional ones that required us to listen before anyone was comfortable calling them deliberate rather than imprecise. In the end, 7 were clear enough to document formally as material misrepresentations, each one pointing, in aggregate, toward conditions that would have shifted significant liability and financial exposure away from Aldrin Partners and toward Callaway Medical Group. The identity of who had retained Luke for the purpose of this distortion emerged 2 days later, not through anything Arthur was party to, but through Diane's legal team and a thread that connected Luke to a competitor firm that had been trying to acquire one of Callaway Medical's key compounds for 18 months without success. It was, when it came out, a plan that was both more sophisticated and more fragile than it had appeared, which Arthur thought was true of most plans that depended on no one in the room paying attention. Gerald called him the following morning. The call was brief and uncomfortable. Gerald said he understood that Arthur had been engaged by the client at her direct request, and that the building's ownership had confirmed this was appropriate given the circumstances. He said he didn't fully understand what had happened. He said he wasn't sure the discretion policy covered whatever category this fell under. He said he would need to review the situation with HR. Arthur told him he understood. He did understand. He also understood that Gerald was a man who managed by category, and what had happened in that boardroom didn't fit the categories he had. Diane called the following afternoon. She told him the negotiation with Aldrin Partners had been rescheduled for the following week with a certified interpretation service and a parallel real-time transcript protocol that her legal team had spent 2 days constructing. She told him that Hendrik had confirmed through his own counsel that the consortium had noticed the translation irregularities during the session and had been deciding whether to raise them when Diane had effectively raised them herself. She said the deal was not dead. She said it was cleaner now than it had been before the session, which was not how these things usually worked. Then she asked him something that she had clearly been deciding whether to ask. She said her company had a regulatory compliance function that was, in her words, competent but not rigorous. She said rigorous was the word she used when she meant the difference between adequate and excellent. She said she was not offering him a position because she felt she owed him something. She was offering it because the previous afternoon, watching him work through 11 disputed clauses, with the same patient attention he had probably once applied in a very different kind of room, she had recognized something she didn't find easily. She told him she found it harder to hire than talent. Arthur didn't respond immediately. He stood in the kitchen of the house he and Nora shared near Parkdale, looking at the calendar on the refrigerator where Nora had written her school schedule in blue marker. He thought about 3 years of early mornings and service carts, and the particular discipline it took to make yourself small when you had once been something else. He thought about the anteroom chair, about what it had cost him to stand up from it. He told Diane he would need a week to think about it. She said that was reasonable. He spent part of that week doing what he had not done in 3 years, which was reviewing his professional materials. His credentials were current. He had kept them current the way some people kept a coat in good condition in the back of a closet, not because they expected to wear it again, but because getting rid of it felt like a different kind of decision. He talked to Nora, who listened to the whole thing in the way she listened to things that mattered to her without interrupting. When he finished, she said she had always thought the gray vest was a bit much. He called Diane the following Thursday and accepted. The gray service vest went to a donation bin on Roncesvalles Avenue on a Tuesday morning in October. Arthur drove there in the same car he had been driving for 7 years, a practical vehicle in a color that didn't announce itself, and dropped the vest through the slot without ceremony. Then he drove back and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the calendar and thought about Ellen, who had always said the quietest people in any room were usually the ones who understood it best. He had agreed with her then. He agreed with her still. He had just spent 3 years proving it from the wrong side of the serving cart, and he suspected the only person in any of it who would have found that funny was her. There was no contract signed that afternoon in the 32nd floor boardroom. No deal was closed. The partnership between Callaway Medical Group and Aldrin Partners was eventually formalized 6 weeks later in a session that was documented in 4 languages, reviewed by 3 legal teams, and conducted without incident. It was reported in 2 trade publications as a significant milestone in cross-border pharmaceutical licensing. Neither publication mentioned the afternoon in October when a man in a gray service vest had quietly decided that the cost of speaking the truth was smaller than the cost of knowing it and saying nothing. Some things never make the record. That doesn't mean they didn't hold everything else together.